I'm a researcher, therefore we'll start with a little experiment together. In urban stress research, an important paradigm is whether you have been growing up urban, and if yes, in which extent. So therefore, I would like to know how many inhabitants did the city count where you grew up, or the place where you grew up. First, below 10,000. Second option is between 10,000 and 100,000. Third option is between 100,000 and 1 million. And fourth option is bigger than 1 million. And in order to now assess the situation and the count here in this room, I would like you to respond by humming. It's like, if the option applies to you. So we just practice it once, humming. First, all the women, please, hum. Very good. That's the way to respond. And now the man. Wow. It's the difference, right? So now everyone who has grown up in a place smaller than 10,000 inhabitants. Good. 10,000 to 100,000? Okay. 100,000 to 1 million? Oh, bigger than 1 million? Very good. Fantastic. Thank you. So I'm a psychiatrist, and I see patients every day. And I'm interested in what makes us more sensible and more vulnerable towards stress. A few years ago, I fell over the fact that city living is a relevant risk factor for some major psychiatric diseases. The risk for schizophrenia is about twice as high in cities, and it even comes with a double-dose relationship. First, for the amount of time one has grown up in a city, and second, for the size of the city you have been raised in. And so the larger the city, the longer you have been living in a city, the higher your risk for schizophrenia later as an adult. And this is important evidence pointing towards causality. Studies have also shown that the risk for schizophrenia changes if someone moves between urban and rural areas during childhood. City living is a risk factor with a similar effect size as cannabis consumption in individuals with a genetic risk profile for schizophrenia. The risk for depression is about 40% higher if you live urban. The risk for anxiety disorders is 20% higher if you live in a city. So, do cities really drive us crazy? The answer is yes. In a way, they do, although they mean freedom and individual development for many of us, probably for most of us here in this room. Cities are important motors of socialization and integration of our countries, and as we know, they host the economic, the political, the scientific, and cultural power of nations. Urban populations do, on average, live under improved conditions. They are wealthier, they receive better health care, better sanitation, contraception, and so on. But the problem is our brains do not seem to be optimally designed for living in the densely populated metropolises of our world. That does not mean that city living is harmful per se for our mental health. It rather means that living urban or not interacts with our brains and with other risk factors, such as a genetic, psychological, or social risk for mental ill health. And why is this important? Because the global population living in cities is growing dramatically. And I would even say that urbanization is the essential change that mankind is facing within the next decades, with probably a comparable health impact as climate change has on us. Let me explain this. In 1950, a third of the world's population lived in cities. Today, it's slightly above 50%, and in 2050, about 2/3 of the global population will live in urban environments, and that's an enormous increase. Of course, the big cities of our world grow at different paces. Delhi in India is growing by 64 individuals per hour. Berlin by 5. But interestingly, the urban-rural risk difference for mental ill health is more pronounced in the cities of the global north than in the global south. So, if we see more mental health problems in cities, and they're all stress-related mental health problems, is increased stress exposure of urban dwellers the reason? And if yes, what is particularly stressful about urban environments? And how does that stress get under the skin? Available evidence points towards the key role of two variants of social stress in the context of city living: social density and social isolation. Social density can mean a constant threat for the social order we live in. Overcrowding can induce illness and stress in species ranging from insects to rodents to primates, including humans. And social isolation has consistently been shown to cause excess mortality, and that comes even with a stronger effect than smoking, alcohol abuse, or obesity. So, is it increased stress, social stress exposure in crowded urban environments that drives us crazy when the environment becomes less controllable for the individual? Brain imaging data from our colleagues in Mannheim nicely contributed to understanding the role of social stress in this respect. The authors used functional magnetic resonance imaging to investigate the human brain structures that are affected by urban living. Participants lived or had lived in rural areas, small towns, or large cities. And the authors measured regional brain activation while participants performed a social stress task. And this is done by letting the participants solve hard arithmetic problems, mathematical problems, under time pressure with constant negative feedback from the experimenter. So they give comments, devaluating comments like, "You're among the worst that have ever been investigated in this laboratory, please speed up, please concentrate more." So that's really inducing social stress. Now, of the activated brain regions, two were of particular interest. Activation in the amygdala, a region which signals negative emotions and environmental threat, correlated with the size of the city in which an individual currently resided. And activation of another area, the anterior cingulate cortex, a major part of the brain's stress regulation system, correlated with how long a participant had lived in a large city during their childhood. So, city living leaves its traces in the brain. My group has just finished a study with the German Federal Environment Office, Umweltbundesamt, which shows that the social stress response of the urban brain is also influenced by other environmental factors. We used the same social stress task in 42 healthy male volunteers from Berlin, and we found that the brain reacts more vulnerable towards social stress with increasing exposure to particulate matter, PM2.5, at the area of residence. Whereas the opposite is true for urban green space. With increasing percentage of green space in a radius of 1,500 meters around the area of residence, the brain shows better emotion regulation and more resilience under stress. So the problem seems to arise where social stress in the city converges with other risk factors, such as environmental factors or socio-demographic factors like old age or having a migrant status, both of which might set you at an increased risk for social isolation. In our group, we have shown that people living in two traditional working class regions in Berlin, Wedding and Moabit, show more symptoms of mental distress with increasing poverty in their neighborhoods, something which is a driver of social stress. But noteworthy, there was no relationship to people's own poverty. They only responded to the poverty around them with more mental distress. However, this correlation only was found in migrants, but not in people of German descent. Now, the toxic situation arises when urban stress comes on top of other risk factors, on top of a pre-existing fragile situation, or when there is an unequal access to the urban advantage in order to compensate for stress and environmental threat. Now, what is the consequence? First of all, the readout of this does not suggest that cities cause mental problems per se. We should be aware of that. But city living affects the stress-associated processing of our emotions, and that can have a health impact on individuals that already carry an increased risk for experiencing social stress. And we urgently need to know more about the characteristics of these vulnerable groups. Who are they and where do they live, in order to take them into focus of good prevention strategies. We need more information about the cofactors that translate urban stress into something health-threatening, like, for example, particulate matter or a migration background, and by which mechanisms they may translate into brain disorders. And we need to increase our understanding about the stress protective factors of city living, the elements which form the basis of what we call the urban advantage, which means the gift of living under conditions of cultural wealth and social diversity with easy access to education and to good health care. Therefore, we need to better understand the influence of the built and social environment on the access to the urban advantage, on our mental states, our behavior, and our well-being. And how the environment interacts with people and stimulates social interaction and social cohesion, which is the antidote to social stress. Both built and social environment are not a question of fate, but of urban planning and strategy. What does that mean in terms of immediate action? Well, clearly to reduce social stress exposure and maximize access to the urban advantage into what forms the resilience for our mental well-being. And that is firstly minimizing the experience of uncontrollable social density, further reducing social isolation, particularly in at-risk populations, for example, the old population, migrants, or the many people living on their own in our large cities. Thirdly, provide enough public space. Public space is where social interaction develops, which prevents us from social isolation. But I'm seriously concerned because the percentage of public space is rapidly decreasing in our cities. And further, provide enough green space in urban settings, green space that directly increases the stress resilience of our brains. What we need is a public mental health strategy for our cities. If it's true that urban dwellers have a twofold risk for schizophrenia, and if it's true that the percentage of the urban population worldwide is increasing rapidly, then there is an absolute urgency. In that case, we have no time to lose. Then it's high time to call for planning cities which are good for us. 4 years ago, together with the Alfred Herrhausen Society, I founded an interdisciplinary group of researchers and practitioners coming from the urban sciences, from architecture, urban design, from neuroscience, from psychiatry and psychology to do the joint research we need. on how the urban environment influences our brains and our mental well-being, and to work on such a public mental health strategy. And we called this approach Neurourbanism. If we pull together what we already know in our different fields, we should be able to create cities, buildings, and housing modalities which maximize the advantage of urban living while minimizing the health risks it may have. Only a few days ago, we have published our Charter of Neurourbanism, which presents some of these ideas. Go to www.neurourbanistic.de and I'll see you there. Thank you.